Hello, I'm Jeff Nyquist, and this is Friends and Enemies, and I am here with my friend Alex Benesch in Germany. I'm in the United States. We're going to talk about, in the end, we're going to talk about spies, the intelligence war, the War of the Moles, and in the context of Cold War and philosophy and communism and education, because you have to understand why the CIA and the BND in Germany failed in their mission of fighting communism, which is my argument, and the FBI ultimately failed, and why our society ultimately failed to stop communism, has to do with the infiltration of education by the communists. Because they create then a mentality very subtly in the educated student over a period of decades. And those students go into the services. They become bureaucrats. They become intelligence analysts. They become politicians. And their whole worldview then is skewed by their education. And of course, I was a high school teacher in the 1980s, taught some college, and really had some serious questions about what was going on. And Alex has reviewed what has gone on in Germany with the education system. So we're going to go through the education system as a kind of indoctrination, and then how that conditioned our bureaucracy to subsequently lose the war of the moles and the war against communism. So, Alex, why don't you begin?
Well, let me take you back to, let's say, the 1850s. Okay, so this was a time of Karl Marx, who was a German, and Germany was a breeding ground for socialism. Germany was also a breeding ground for some of the new sciences, and also these Enlightenment groups, which have weird connections. So I think everybody knows the Bavarian Illuminati, but there were actually many more of these organizations at the
And you might
universities.
mention that the 1850s followed the Revolution of 1848, which had a
Yes.
big aftermath. And I
Yeah.
might mention the latter day pamphlets of the great Scottish, English, British writer Thomas Carlyle, who basically characterized the Revolution of 1848 as a kind of a breakdown of monarchy and the breakdown of a proper order in Europe, and bemoaned it greatly. That's why he called it the Latter Day Pamphlets. And so this is the condition that he said. He said the monarchs basically conceded their authority to the masses, and that democracy was now inevitable and was a disaster. And of course,
Well,
he talked about emerging. Carlyle used the imagery of a ship trying to go around Cape Horn. Cape Horn is a terribly dangerous place. There's massive storms. The waves of the ocean are like mountains. That the ship is a little ship is like a little dinghy going way up this giant thing and then coming down and going up and being tossed about. And he said that how could a ship, going through the storm, survive if they got to vote on the captain, if the crew gets to vote, if the captain doesn't have authority? And he made that as the ship of state, as the analogy. And he said this is what he saw was the future doom of Europe. So go ahead, 1850s Germany.
yeah, so basically you had competing concepts of what the world should be and what the future should be. So at that time, the United States was roughly 80 years old. So some naysayers had predicted early on that the United States would fail. So I think in the year 1800, the year 1800 was an important election in America. This was projected to be the first handover of power, I believe it was, from one party to the other. And some of the naysayers in Europe, they kind of predict that this would end up in civil war. A republic cannot work. It's impossible. But the United States moved forward. And so 50 years later, the United States still hadn't broken down. This was a hot debate in Europe. How to proceed. Should we have a republic? Should we have socialism? Should we have a continuation of serfdom, or should we have a half monarchy like the Brits? This was a very, very hot debate. And in the middle of all this was the progress of science. And people interpreted this differently, what it meant. So some people said, well, science means we can pull off a republic everywhere. Some people said, science means we can have bureaucrats run everything, which would be socialism. And so people had very different ideas of an enlightenment in Germany and in other places over here. And so in this climate, you had scientists figuring out the early stages of psychology. So this is a group of scientists at these very established universities, and they sort of were trying to measure the mind. You know, what's the skill set of one person? How quickly can this person perform tasks versus the other? And then they were looking at children and adolescents. How do they evolve? You know, what's the differences, and what influences them and what doesn't influence them? And so you had this character. His name was Wilhelm Wundt, and he was one of the big shots at the time in science. He studied at Tübingen and Heidelberg, and so he became the next big thing in psychology. Now, his prime students, who came from America, later returned to America and created psychology as a new field of science in the United States. And they also created the new school system in the United States. So there's no indication that, or no strong indication that Mr. Wundt was a socialist per se. But he was sort of developing tools that were later used by socialists or communists. So this is like, let's say you make an invention and it can be used for good, it can be used for bad. You figure out what works for children in their development and what doesn't work. So at the time, some people believed that property should be abolished. You could not have a republic. It would always end up in exploitation and monopolism and imperialism. This is kind of the school of thought a bit later of Mr. Lenin. This was also Marx earlier, but this also became Lenin. So you cannot have a republic, it's impossible. And so people should be taught in a certain way. So this Wilhelm Wundt, this weird German scientist, almost like a Robert Oppenheimer type, and his students created psychology in the new school system in America. This guy was influenced by Hermann von Helmholtz, and this name is still reverberating in the world of science. So you get the Helmholtz Institute, and they do all kinds of things. And this Helmholtz guy was connected to these Enlightenment people who were tied to the order of the Illuminati. And so they had kind of their own ideas of how the world should be. So, for example, you had Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was an influence on Mr. Wundt. Leibniz he made a big career in Hanover, and he was close to Princess Sophie Charlotte of Hanover. Her brother became King George I of Britain. Now, this is important to understand because the later King George III, who was also from the same Hanover line, King George III was not happy about the idea of an American republic. So he sent his troops to fight the rebels in the United States. And so these Enlightenment circles in Europe, there was always some intelligence shenanigans going on. And of course, socialist communists tried to get into the game. Some performed or some acted openly. They said they were communists. And some communists, they disguised themselves as just Enlightenment. And they were pretty vague in their statements. And so these Mr. Wundt opened the first laboratory ever to be exclusively devoted to psychological studies. This marked the official birth of psychology as an independent field of study. And people that got involved in this field, they did not want to believe in the concept of a soul. They viewed humans as machines. Now, and this concept specifically was then exaggerated by the communists because they believed a child is a blank slate, and the more communism you indoctrinate into this child, the more this child will be a happy communist and will go along with the program. So even today, to communists, everything is about ideology, and they don't care about the biology. They don't care about quintessential human things. They just want to solve everything through ideology. And so you can imagine that the universities at the time were saturated with socialist networks alongside the Enlightenment networks. So this was already a spy problem at the time because the socialists were afraid of industrial capitalism, which was already a thing in the 1850s and then, of course, in the coming decades. So they did not want that. And so then you got these Americans going to Germany and studying under, these Americans were studying under Wilhelm Wundt. So you had James McKean Cattell, first professor of psychology in the United States, Granville Stanley Hall, the father of child psychology, an adolescent developmental theorist, Charles Hubbard Judd, director of the School of Education, University of Chicago, Walter Dill Scott, Harvard, Edward Bradford Titchener, and some others, and also John Dewey. So these people studied under Mr. Wundt, with his weird Illuminati connections and connections straight to basically King George I, and then later King George II. These Americans then returned home to the United States and created the field of psychology and the new school system, the educational system. And so you had some of these Americans who were almost openly socialist. They created the so-called New School for Social Research. And they also had one guy, I'm just checking my notes here. They had one guy who was a big fan of the Soviet Union, of all things. And let me see, this was not John Dewey. Dewey was kind of the star.
Many were fans of the Soviet Union at first. Dewey was until he actually went there. And it's a kind of, what was it? The League for Industrial Democracy in New York was kind of the front organization, if I'm recalling my socialist history. And it's sort of like the Fabian Society.
Yeah, the League for Industrial Democracy. That's correct.
The League for Industrial Democracy, yeah.
That is correct.
Yeah. And of course, these were groups of socialists who wanted to kind of make America in this model back more than 100 years ago. And I believe its origins were pre-Soviet, pre-Lenin. I think it started in the early 20th century, if I'm remembering correctly.
Just checking my notes here. I mean, these they were not exactly all the same, but they kind of created the modern school system in America. They were the stars, and they brought this stuff from Germany to America. So, for example, the New School for Social Research was founded in 1919 by Charles Beer, John Dewey, James Harvey Robinson, and Thorstein Veblen. We talked about him in a previous show. He was sort of a socialist technocrat. He wanted to make it look more fancy, but it was still socialism, what he was preaching. And they also called it the University in Exile because they were recruiting scientists, academics who fled Italy, who fled fascism in Italy and who also fled fascism in Germany. And so, this is also where, for example, the critical theory came from, guys that came from Germany to America. And so you had Herbert Marcuse, for example, who expanded on this concept of leftist critical theory, which is basically just trash talking everything that's established, white people, men, whatever. You just trash talk everything, and that's supposed to create change. And this was built in America as anti-fascist research because these people fled Germany and fascism was a problem. So this is kind of how these refugees really, how they got to do this sort of socialist, communist research. They could do this in America, and it was internally billed as, well, just anti-fascism, because we don't want fascism to return. So then we got this Mr. G. Stanley Hall. And G. Stanley Hall consistently argued against intellectual attainment at all levels of public education. Open discussion, critical opinions were not to be tolerated, and so on and so forth. And then we had this Charles Hubbard Judd obtained a PhD at the University of Leipzig in Germany under Wilhelm Wundt. And Judd was then director of the Department of Education at the University of Chicago. He did that for a long time. And he worked at the psychological lab at Yale, and so on and so forth. They were also doing psychometrics at the time. This was kind of a starting field at the time. Why does somebody have leftist ideas, or why does somebody like conservative ideas? They really wanted to find out why people chose one over the other. And so some of these people, they brought some very troubling ideas to the United States. So, for example, using bad methods to teach children how to read. And some of these students of Mr. Wundt, they also believed school should be a social institution for social purposes. This is not supposed to make people necessarily smarter and turn them all into entrepreneurs. It was more like a social gathering, and you were supposed to make people have a social consciousness. They use a vague language. They have some very nice sounding. They had some very nice sounding ideas in that. But if I remember my school days, it was very far to the left, and we're talking Bavaria. So usually you would think Bavaria would still be more conservative. But I had my arts teacher. After 9/11, I had my arts teacher saying something along the lines of, it was about time the Americans, were hit back. For all the evil that America has done, now is the day they get it back. So she was kind of gleeful about 9/11. This was my arts teacher, paid for with, paid by the government, taxpayer money, and all of that. And so most of my teachers were pretty far to the left, and there was literally nothing in the curriculum, nothing whatsoever, that would instill reasonable values into the students. So of course they were advertising for the Enlightenment, the tradition of the Enlightenment, but then they were just giving us an overview of what the German system of government looks like, and some baseline info about what a constitution is and what the parliament does, but nobody really got any values from that. Nobody knew anything about history. And now with my kids, they go to these schools now. My daughter is visiting a school which is named after Mr. Leibniz, who was very close to the sister of King George I. And I'm looking into these history books, and it's utter garbage. It is complete garbage. I'm looking into these other books, and it's horrifying. It's really horrifying. These children have no idea about anything. So they had to learn, some details about, the first French Constitution after the Revolution, but they were supposed to learn this stuff by heart and then put it on paper, but they didn't understand anything about anything. So I was asking my daughter these simple questions, what is this about? Who are these groups? Who wants what? What is the moral dilemma here? What did the Russians do at the time? What did the British do? What did the Germans do? What was all the backstabbing in Europe? And these competing ideas. She had no idea. So they're learning about the French Revolution. They have zero idea that America at the time was, really a republic. They're not able to compare. If you ask these students, these 13, 14-year-old teenagers, what's the difference between Tsarist Russia, the half monarchy in Britain, the chaos in Germany, the chaos in France, and the United States? What's the difference? They have absolutely zero idea. They couldn't explain you anything. But you can get good grades if you just learn some of this stuff and then put it on paper. I mean, this zero sense of how these systems were run, how intelligence worked, absolutely nothing. And it's just this. We had this discussion about Henry Kissinger. Now Kissinger, he got to go to Harvard, and then he was learning about this time, and he was studying Metternich, and he was studying Lord Castlereagh and all these people. But this was on another level. He was kind of being groomed, and he was getting deeper into this stuff, and he got to be this supposed statesman. If you go through this regular school system, you have zero idea about all these things. What they do this. I mean, in Europe, they do these surveys. So they ask these children, when was World War One? Why did World War One happen? What was World War Two about? And they have zero idea. Especially when it gets to the 1800s or 1700s, they know nothing, absolutely zero. I mean, some of these students, they actually believe, and this has been tested, they believe the Battle of Helm's Deep was somehow the main battle of World War One. Now, the Battle of Helm's Deep is from the Lord of the Rings. So it's just completely pathetic what the schools are teaching these kids.
The Battle of Helm's Deep from Lord of the Rings was a battle in World War One. Oh my gosh!
Yeah, it's a multiple choice question. What was the most important battle in Israel? And they just say, well, Helm's Deep, maybe. And that's
because they are more familiar with TV and movies than they are with history.
Or they just don't know, and they say, well, the Battle of Helm's Deep, that sounds kind of cool. Maybe that was the main one, and they just put an X, or they just mark that answer because they have zero idea, and they do these tests on a regular basis. And a staggering amount of German students, they cannot really tell you the difference between Soviet East Germany, Western Germany, and the Nazi regime. They don't go back as.
This is interesting because when I was in my 20s and I would meet someone from Germany, I would find they were generally better educated, or a French person or a British. I would find generally they were better educated in their basic education than Americans. And this was back in the 80s, right? So now what you're saying is that it's really all the same as in America. Because I give you an example. I took over in 1980. Was it in the spring semester of 1986? I took over a U.S. history class, which is taught to 11th graders. This is 12th grade is the senior, 11th grade are the juniors. And I decided I wanted to know where the class was, because in American history, they teach all the way up to the Civil War, up to Reconstruction. They sort of begin the second half of American history in the second semester. They begin with Reconstruction after the Civil War. And so I wanted to know what they knew. So I asked questions about Columbus and about the American, who fought the American Revolution,
Yeah.
right? And so this is a class of about 34. I had 34 in that class, and there were only 5 students who could answer these questions. So 29 of the 34 students in that course couldn't answer basic questions about the most basic things
Whew.
about what happened in American history. And they'd already just had they already had the first semester. They just finished it. They supposedly all passed, right?
Yeah.
But they didn't have any. And so I thought, well, what was the teach? And of course, the teaching method was you graded on a curve. You didn't test them too hard. You didn't make them do the homework. And I got a little bit of trouble with the head of the history department because I made them do the homework. But the standards were it's like the head of the department said, oh, you can't make them do that. I wanted them to actually write essays
Yeah.
about what they were reading to make sure they read it. And I gave quizzes at the end of every week. But it was terrible. It was like you could bring a horse to water, we have a saying, but you can't make
Yeah.
it drink,
Yeah, but it's also a teacher problem or a university professor problem. I was at university. This was around 2006, I believe, and I was listening to this professor explain to us why Russia is on a good course and why the German-Russian relationship is doing well, and it's all
Okay, this
heading.
is in a Bavarian school. About what year was this?
2006, I say 2006.
Oh my goodness. Okay, this
Yeah.
is after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and also I also have to add this. I think one of the main sources of money and administration for this university, one of the biggest, the controlling institution for that university was the Catholic Church. Now, I wasn't specifically aiming at a Catholic university. It just happened to I just ended up at that university. But you would think that at a very Christian university in Bavaria, that you would not get professors say these things, but they were very big on it. And
So they basically thought Putin was a Christian then? Is that what they thought? What they were
no, they
saying?
didn't go that far. But the Catholic Church was working with the Russian Orthodox Church, which is run by the KGB, or has been,
Right, absolutely.
for a very long time. And so there's this narrative of it's a common Roman heritage. So we have sort of the Western Roman heritage, they have the Eastern Roman heritage. Couldn't we work together and everything would be great and harmonious? But I was voicing my opinion as a young student, voicing the opinion that I don't really see this heading into a good direction at all. And I wasn't really getting an explanation for why this was supposedly heading in a positive direction. So they were going by, the program they had in front of them. They were very convinced of what they were saying. And so then, for a bit of cultural shock, we had an American professor, an American guest professor, a woman, and she gave a presentation. And she gave her presentation. It was one of the largest rooms that they had. Everybody wanted
Do you
in on
remember
this.
what school she was from? Do you remember?
No, no, been too long. But she gave. I remember the title of the presentation. Maybe I can find that online. The presentation was called "The Foreign Policy of the Country with the Biggest Guns," and so she was basically explaining to the Europeans that they were being silly. They should have a more positive view of America. I'm not sure her presentation was really designed to have that effect, to make these people like America more and trust America more.
Yeah.
But so this is sort of the cultural difference. So you get like this one American voice saying, "Yeah, we're America. Somebody has to." Somebody has to be
And the
involved.
war in Iraq is going on, and the war in Afghanistan, which was portrayed quite negatively in Germany at the time, and throughout Europe and France as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was not. Let me put it this way: it was there was no objective view at the time in Europe. So you were either blindly following, the Bush administration, or you were completely against America, and you were supposed to like the Russians, even though the Russians at the time they were trying their own version of the war on terror, and intelligence
They had fought
suggests.
in Chechnya. They
Yeah,
called it
and
Operation Anti-Terror, the war in
yeah,
Chechnya,
and
the Second Chechen War.
yeah, and
Yeah.
intelligence suggests that Russia was deep inside. I mean, the intelligence agencies of Russia, they were deep inside the Islamists in Chechnya, and so there was all sorts of funny business going on. And
Yeah, I should note that there are some sources that believe that the Russians, in fact, Mufti Kadyrov, who was the father of the guy, I think he just passed away, the president of Chechnya, Kadyrov, he actually gave an interview in, I think it was January of the year 2000, when the Second Chechen War was just a few months old, in which he told Chechens, stay out of this war because the Russians are directing both sides. The
yeah,
Russians are directing the rebellion, and you'll get caught up in this. Basically, he was describing a scissors strategy, and I've called it the Chechen alibi. And because there's stories, there's Chechen commanders who were said to be dead, and they'd show up and have press conferences. And there's questions about how this war originated and what it was designed to do. There was a communist official in Ossetia, northern Ossetia, who gave a statement, who intimated that, oh, the Chechens are our great friends, and that the Chechen War was a kind of an arranged thing. He later intimated, he spoke in that Aesopian language, that they were cleaning up Chechnya by like a provocation. They did the war as a provocation. They were willing to sacrifice Russian soldiers to draw out the poisons, to draw out the really anti-Russian elements in Chechnya, so they could slaughter them and kill them and imprison them.
yeah. So that was something I noticed. I noticed early on that Russia was rather quiet at the time, and so Russia didn't want the attention. The Russians were benefiting from the negative blowback, of the Bush administration. So everybody was looking at America, and everybody was, most of the interpretations were almost Leninist. So this Lenin idea of capitalism is in its final stages. It's turning into this madness, imperialism. And so this is just proof to these people that Lenin was right. But Lenin was so vague. He was just whining and complaining about the West. And so this was almost like a perfect storm, not just in Europe.
Nobody in Germany said, hey, look, all of our oil comes through the Persian Gulf. And to have an armed maniac in Iraq who could attack the tankers, who had invaded Kuwait, who was a threat to Saudi Arabia, which is the real reason America initially deployed in the first Gulf War, was they were afraid Saddam was going to invade Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi army was not sufficient to stop the Iraqi army. If Saddam had wanted to occupy the Saudi oil fields, he could have. So we had to create the coalition. We had to defend it. And I think George H.W. Bush very wisely refrained from invading Saddam Hussein. He went only a little ways into Iraq and pulled back. A lot of people criticized him for that, but I think that was wise because once the U.S. went in to topple Saddam, we created a vacuum. And because our liberal ideology was, well, we have to make a democracy wherever we conquer, we were making a democracy in a majority Shiite country that was going to then look to Iran. And as long as Iraq and Saddam was there, Iran and Iraq were at each other's throats. They were counterbalancing each other. But the minute you destroyed the Sunni regime in Iraq, you knocked that balance out. So that now today, Saudi Arabia is just so afraid of Tehran and Tehran, who's holding the leash on Iran? Moscow and Beijing. So now you have, as soon as you have a president like Biden, who comes along and has called the Saudi royalty murderers because of the Khashoggi death in Turkey, you suddenly have the Saudis going, oh my gosh, he's going to let Iran get us. He's not going to defend us. Biden's not going to defend us. And so we better make a deal with the Chinese because they're holding the leash, and the Russians because they're holding the leash on the Iranians. Yeah. And I think that's what's happened.
There wasn't, I mean, in the school system, in the university system, in the media, over here, there was no mature discussion, okay? And you could, I mean, if you talk to the people, I mean, they didn't have any foundation in these matters, war.
But didn't they know where their gasoline and their petrol comes from?
Not really. I mean, it's just people had no idea about wars. They had no idea about security overall. They had no idea about intelligence. So they were almost like children. And so this is what the Russians then used for their advantage. They were saying, well, basically Lenin was right. America is out of control. America is now the problem of the world. And so everybody should look at Russia because Russia is now the new leader of the world. This was the message at the time, and I was not buying that for a second. I mean, I was trying to figure out the background of, let's say, the war on terror, and I was not aware at the time that American intelligence was gutted because of the Russian moles, like Robert Hanssen and Aldrich Ames. So that made it harder to track Al Qaeda. And I did, I think it was this week, I did a report on that Al Qaeda cell in Hamburg. This was Mohammed Atta, and this was some of these other guys. They were living in the same apartment in Hamburg, and they were constantly being visited by these other important Al Qaeda people. The German authorities, they knew these guys were important, and but they, for some weird reason, they did not get a court order to put surveillance equipment inside that apartment. So so we're clear on this for everybody who's listening right now. 9/11 could have been prevented, and the whole, this war on terror, all this could have been prevented with one listening device in a single Hamburg apartment, the infamous Hamburg terror cell.
Where Mohammed Atta was, what was he, an engineering student, if I remember correctly?
Yeah, of course. And it just, they were visiting the most radical mosque in Hamburg at the time. And people have to understand, Hamburg is a quintessential red city. So you get red politicians, red judges, red district attorneys, red police, especially
for our American
police.
Audience who's now been confused by this color scheme, red means communist.
Yeah. I mean,
You
that,
see, it's
yeah.
funny what the media in America has done
Of
is they've
course,
met
of course,
red means
in America, it's
flyover
the
country,
Republicans. Yeah, in America,
right?
it's
Yeah,
the red states are the Republican states,
and
blue
right,
states are the
and
Democratic
blue
states.
are the which it should be the opposite, but they didn't do it that way.
Yeah.
Very confusingly.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's a very communist city. So most important people are communists, and the senator at the time of Hamburg, responsible for the security of Hamburg, that guy was Olaf Scholz, who is now our chancellor. And so the day of 9/11, when these names were tossed around, Mohammed Atta and these others, everybody was super shocked in Hamburg, especially Mr. Olaf Scholz, our current chancellor. So they were raiding apartments and they were saying, "Oh my God, these people lived here and they were visiting Afghanistan, then returned back to Germany, then moved to America. They moved to America and then they did 9/11. Oh dear." And so these guys, Mohammed Atta and the others, they applied for visa to travel to America. And apparently the Germans forgot to warn the Americans, don't let these guys into your country because they seem really suspicious. You know, they visit radical mosques, they have weird contacts, they all gather in this one apartment at Marienstraße 54 in Hamburg. This is not good. So they're flagged. Don't let them into America. But somebody forgot to do that. Now,
Oh, well, maybe the evil American imperialists had it coming.
well, this is sort of what I'm afraid of.
For Red
Actually,
Hamburg.
this I mean, let's run this scenario. Okay, let's think of, well, Hamburg is a communist city. You get these radicals running around, and these communists running the city. They may have thought, well, as communists, we believe in the struggle against imperialism, so we love the radical Muslims or we tolerate the radical Muslims. Let's not bother them too much. Let's not look too hard. Maybe that's what it was, but maybe it was worse because we're not just talking about the American moles, Robert Hanssen and the FBI and Oliver James of the CIA. We always had moles in Germany, especially in the intelligence agencies. Now, the Interior Intelligence Service, which is called the Verfassungsschutz, they were responsible for, tracking Islamic extremism, especially in Hamburg. So why did this fail? Why didn't they put one stinking listening device into that stinking apartment? One device. No 9/11, no war on terror. Why didn't that happen? What exactly was? Didn't they apply for a search warrant? Was the search warrant not granted? Was the judge a communist? What is this? And so it's sort of this possibility there was a mole in the Interior Intelligence Service and some other moles, and these moles were able theoretically to sabotage the investigation. Take a little bit of intelligence out here, take a little bit out there, and just, fumble a few things. And so then these terrorists...
These moles, they've been caught since?
No, but over the course of the German Republic, several high-ranking moles have been caught, but nobody is guaranteeing you that all of them have been caught, and nobody knows.
These moles were from Russia? They were Russian moles?
Russian moles, yeah, communist moles. So in the Interior Intelligence Service and, of course, the Foreign Intelligence Service of Germany, these moles were, they had access to almost everything. And so this is sort of this thing that I was completely unaware of at the time, that Russia's intelligence was severely damaging Western intelligence. Then 9/11 happened. And then the Russians used 9/11 and the war on terror to shred America's reputation in the world, especially
Absolutely.
in Europe. Especially in Europe.
And in Latin America, by the way. If you went to Latin,
Yeah.
I've talked to people coming back from Chile, watching Chilean TV after 9/11, after our invasion of Iraq, and they were basically depicting us as baby killers, same as the Vietnam War stuff. We weren't fighting a totalitarian dictator. in Iraq and terrorists in Afghanistan. We were, because a bomb goes off course and hits a wedding, or we hit some other civilian group. It was like we were doing it on purpose.
Yeah.
Whereas Russians intentionally in the war in Ukraine are intentionally wiping out
Yeah.
civilians, we would accidentally hit them. And
Yeah.
then they would
And
say, "Oh, they've killed 1 million Iraqis." I just don't believe it. I'm sorry. I think
yeah.
that's
And
propaganda.
so uh, during the entire German Republic, Russia, Soviet intelligence, Soviet intelligence was painting us, German people. They were painting us as the forever National Socialists. So we would always be fascist. It was unfixable,
You
and
can't wipe the guilt from your hands. Out
yeah,
damn spy.
because we adopted the concept of republic. We adopted capitalism, so it was inevitable. We were always going to be fascists and imperialists, and it's all going to be
Guilty.
horrible. So
Yeah.
there were operations of Soviet intelligence where they were painting swastikas on Jewish cemeteries. They were doing all kinds of things to keep the impression that that fascism was still a big thing in post-war Germany, which it wasn't really. And so the security services, police services, the military, of course, they did recruit people who served in under National Socialism, but you have to imagine this was after 1945. We were disarmed in Western Germany. We were disarmed, and the Soviets, they still had a sizable force. They were building up they still had a sizable force from the war. They were not demobilizing their forces as people had hoped, and they were building up communist East German troops. So under that kind of pressure, obviously, Western Germans had to build up their own military, their own intelligence services. So they were looking at these former military officers. They were looking at these former intelligence officers. And of course, the Americans, they did a very hard sweep. So it was a filtration process. They had the CIC. They called it the counterintelligence. What was it called? What was the full name of the CIC? Counterintelligence Corps. So this was military intelligence from the Americans, and they had a very sophisticated system of filtering out people that they didn't want. So they had a white list and they had a black list. And so what was
And
left...
by the way, I should mention this because it's in Reinhard Gehlen's memoirs, is that Gehlen and his organization, which was mainly, he was in German military intelligence, spying in Russia and the Soviet Union, Foreign Armies East, and they had gotten their files out of Berlin, out of their different headquarters, and they had hidden them. And I think it was, if I remember right, it was in southern Bavaria towards Switzerland, maybe towards Italy, towards the Alps. They were hiding in different places, and they were afraid because the influence of the Russian intelligence over the Americans was strong, and the Russians were like arresting people and asking the Americans to hand over people. And they were afraid if they let themselves be known to the Americans, they weren't sure what the Americans would do with them, because maybe the Russians saw them as something that were to be handed over to them, because they had all these spies working on the Russians. They weren't sure if the Americans would see the value of it. And it was only when Gehlen and his people found some American intelligence officers who realized the value, realized that this friendship between the Soviet Union and the United States, this alliance during World War II, was coming to an end, that the Stalin was not going to respect it anymore. They were able, then they felt like they could hand themselves over and
Yeah.
say, look, this is who we are. We're not just normal German soldiers, and we've got these files. And so then, and of course, you'll see in the American press, they talk about Operation Paperclip, like this is some evil thing where all these evil Nazis were suddenly taken in by the Americans and the Americans became Nazified. This is just nonsense. Reinhard Gehlen was a Prussian aristocrat. He wasn't a Nazi.
Yeah.
And towards the end, as he recites in his memoirs, towards the end of World War II, Hitler wanted to incarcerate Gehlen in an insane asylum because Gehlen was telling them the truth about the strength of the Russian armies, and Hitler didn't want to hear it. And because Hitler wanted to think there was still hope in winning the war. But Gehlen wanted to be useful. He wanted to fight against communism. And so they ended up taking him to Washington, D.C. and helping him form the Gehlen Organization. But you can bet that the leftists and the communists here in this country would have tried to interfere and would have tried to hand him over to the Soviets. They
Yeah.
absolutely would have, because we had those influences here. And of course, those influences were in France and in Great Britain as well.
So you had this filtration process, through American military intelligence. You had a whitelist, you had a blacklist, and Soviet intelligence was trying to recruit as many people as possible in Western Germany. And so you had these people like Heinz Felfe, who was a glowing National Socialist, but he just happened to be a narcissistic type person. He was always trying to make a good impression towards his superiors, but anybody who was on his level or below, he would treat them very badly. So in his mind, and according to his superiors, he was the quintessential National Socialist. He was going through all these ranks, all these selection processes, and this service and that service and that service, and he was moving up the ranks. And he was at some point he joined the SS and also the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, which was the intelligence agency, and he also got police training. So this was military, police, and intelligence training all at once. So he wanted to become a big bureaucrat, essentially. And at some point, Walter Schellenberg recruited Felfe. They made him into an analyst, and he was supposed to look at the material collected in Switzerland and Liechtenstein. Now, Schellenberg was an intelligence chief, and he was Schellenberg.
He was the head of SS Foreign Intelligence.
Yeah.
Starting in 1941, and he wrote a memoir called "The Labyrinth," which is extremely valuable because what he reveals is how penetrated the Third Reich was with Soviet agents and how he had to fight against them within the Third Reich. So Schellenberg is a very clever man.
Yeah, and it's always very rewarding to read books about these people or by these people and get different perspectives and just trying to get a feeling of the time and of the intelligence business. So, I mean, you could have an expanded curriculum in the schools here about intelligence work and the operations and important times. And so this would teach people to watch out for Soviet influence. But these people, they leave school or they leave university and they have absolutely no idea whatsoever. And so this Heinz Felfe guy, after the war, he tried to work for British intelligence, and he was tasked with finding communists. So he was supposed to spy on the communists, and he did that for a while for British intelligence. And he got monthly payments and these food stamps or these specific allocations. And so he was joining the University of Bonn. He wanted to spy against communists. And the Brits knew about his past, so they knew he was a member of the SD. And Felfe then even joined the Communist Party, the Communist Party of Germany. So in public, he was a communist, and he was running out of money. So he had a wife, a child, and his wife was pregnant again. And so he wasn't finding a good job. He was too young during National Socialism, and he was too unpopular. He was not really proven to be really, really good and loyal and just a person you want to work with. And so he was trying to keep his options open. So he was a spy for the Brits. He was spying against the communists. He was trying to get a better job in intelligence or police, but he couldn't find the job he was looking for. So he was starting to consider becoming a traitor. Despite all of his previous National Socialist indoctrination, all the stuff he was pledging, the loyalty to the Führer and everything, none of that mattered to him. It was just about him. And this is something
he was a narcissist, as you said. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the traits of a narcissist, arrogance is a narcissistic trait.
Yeah, and so he was. The British didn't like him that much because they figured out he was not honest with them. He was selling information also to other organizations, such as the first the new interior intelligence service of the Germans. But he was probably not aware of that. This would be traceable. The Brits would find out about this, that he was selling the same information to another organization. And so the Brits didn't like him anymore. And then he wanted to join the Gehlen organization, the predecessor to the BND, Foreign Intelligence. And he was already halfway a traitor when he figured out that his friend, Hans Clemens, that his friend was already spying for the Soviets, and he had already joined the Gehlen organization. So Felfe was at a crossroads here. He could have said, well, I'm going to tell the Gehlen organization, this dude is a Soviet spy. And I had his trust, and I gave him to you. Or we could feed him bad information, so he would relay that information to the Soviets. But he was hedging his bets. It all depended on his own career path. So if he wasn't getting a good job in Germany, he was considering selling out to the Soviets. And he could have gotten...
And by the way, I should mention that because of the feedback loop of moles in Western intelligence agencies, that it's a good career choice for a spy to basically say, well, if I work for the Soviets and they have other moles in the organization, they can feed me things that will make me look like a hero and get me promoted. And then I've got associates, secret associates, helping me in the organization to be elevated. So that is an actual choice. If you realize you're in the BND or you're in the Gehlen organization and you realize there's other moles, you begin to realize that, wait a minute, the Soviets want me to be promoted within the organization. They are going to use all their assets in the organization to get me elevated in rank.
Yeah. And something I always encounter with people is that they have absolutely no concept whatsoever what a recruitment actually looks like. The process and how these people offer their service, or how they're receiving an offer to join Soviet intelligence. So this is something I found over and over again, with conservatives, even conspiracy buffs. I mean, it's astounding to me that when I explain certain examples from history more in detail, the human aspects of that recruitment story, some people they really like to hear that because they didn't know that type of stuff before, because they haven't actually read any significant amount of espionage literature. And so this is kind of what the school system did to us, or let's say, Hollywood movies or television shows. People don't even know what a recruitment looks like. So this guy who was supposed to be this great patriot, was a National Socialist. He was driven to Karlshorst, the spy hub of the communists in Berlin. He was driven to Karlshorst, and then he signed these documents. He received his first cover name. He received the first payment of 300 Deutschmark, and they gave him the first instruction of communication. So where's the dead drop? And then came the microdots and the radio communications. And from that moment, he was a traitor. And he was in constant contact with his Soviet handlers. So he would take a train to Austria. Austria was full of communist spies. He would say, "Oh, this is just a vacation, or I'm just going to visit somebody or whatever." He would drive a train to Austria, go to a certain meeting place, meet his handler, hand over documents, get money, receive money, and new instructions. And this was a personal meeting. And then, of course, they received the new radio equipment. So they had to listen at a specific time. Let's say I think it was Saturdays. So every Saturday at a certain time, he had to turn on this specific radio on a specific frequency and write down the numbers that were being spoken on this radio frequency. So write down the numbers, and they were really bad at this. They had to record the radio transmissions and then listen to them again and write down all these numbers, and then they had to translate these numbers into clear text for the new instructions. And so this went on for years. This is how this works. And so it was not the internal investigations that really got him. It was the Americans, and it was Soviet defectors that really got him. So it was Mikhail Goleniewski, for example, from Poland. And he told the Americans, "Look, I know that in German foreign intelligence, there was a small group of high-ranking people, and these Germans visited America. They visited the CIA in America. And two people on this visit were Soviet agents." So
and by the way, I looked it up. Goleniewski defected in January of 1961.
But he already sent information to the West, I think, before he physically defected.
He was already working for the Western services in Poland. He was a colonel general in Polish military intelligence, which was under Soviet control, of course.
And so, and so the Americans took notice, and they started to investigate Felfe. And they also told some people, at some point they told Reinhard Gehlen. So the CIA meets Reinhard Gehlen, and they say, "Here's a short list of high-level suspects." And Gehlen was mortified, looking at this list, and he was pointing directly at Heinz Felfe, because he was already under suspicion in Germany. But here's what happened. The German intelligence people who were most suspicious of Felfe, they were targeted by Soviet operations. So the Soviets tried to paint these guys as the traitors, because these guys were
to divert the blame onto the innocent. And this is something you're going to see in the CIA, happening in the CIA in the 1960s with the Nosenko versus Golitsyn controversy, where you have actually CIA papers being written suggesting that Angleton and Golitsyn are working for the Soviets, rather than Nosenko being a false defector.
So, in short, without these Soviet defectors and without the Americans, German foreign intelligence would have been dead in the water for probably decades, because these Soviet moles, they were bringing in more Soviet moles, and they could help each other in those positions. And so
they could coordinate. This was the thing that Angleton discovered when he realized pretty early on that the CIA was full of moles. And this is the thing he's been criticized for, because he did become paranoid. Of course, you would be, because it isn't that you're imagining people are working against you. They actually are working against you. And he had something he called the barium test, where Angleton as the head of the counterintelligence staff, would feed false information to certain meetings or groups within the CIA to see how long it would take for the Soviets to act on it. Like something was going to happen somewhere, see if Soviet KGB people showed up there. And of course, they would show up there. So then he would go, somebody in this room of, this meeting of 15 people, somebody in there is a spy. And then he would go to a different thing and he would feed it. And he would find there was a spy in that group too. And then he would try to get overlap, where he could, like a Venn diagram, where he could isolate the smaller group. But it was when he got, when he fed false information that it could actually isolate who it was, the KGB wouldn't act on it. As if the KGB itself was tracking these groups and realizing that they had been fed false information and realizing someone's trying to find out who the agents are.
Yeah, I mean, catching Soviet spy, or being infiltrated by Soviet spies is almost like catching Ebola. So it's just going to multiply, and the problem's going to be bigger and bigger. Eventually, you are being taken over. So this was one guy, and he was caught, and he went to prison for a couple of years, and he was swapped. He went to Soviet East Germany, and then
You're referring to Felfa.
Yeah, Felfa, and he was and he was making these demands. He told the communists over there, "Well, look, I'm not really a communist. I can pretend to be one, but I want a Mercedes or a BMW. I want a nice house. I want a Western color television, and I want a swimming pool with a Western pump system." They actually got him that. So he was making all these outrageous demands, and he wanted to become a professor in criminology, even though he was totally unqualified for that.
Well, except that he was a criminal, so he was kind of qualified.
Right. So that was his list of demands, and he almost got everything because the communists, or the Russians especially, were running this whole show. They wanted to present to the world the image of, we're taking care of our own. He was they called him Kundschafter des Friedens. I don't know whether you call it in English. Ambassador of friendship. Or no, ambassador of peace. That's what they called these traitors. And so they had to paint this picture of, we're taking care of these people. So he got the house, he got the Mercedes, he got all this stuff. But this one thing they wouldn't give him, the right to travel outside of the Soviet Union.
So, yes, of course.
Yeah. And he said, he felt he was trapped. He was felt like he was in prison. He wanted, he didn't like it there, and he was keeping up his demands of foreign travel, but they would not allow him to do that. And I remember when Snowden was interviewed for television after he went to Russia, they filmed him in this luxurious place. Could have been a hotel, or could have been any sort of old school building in Moscow or St. Petersburg. They were trying to paint this picture of, he's taken care of. He's living a good life. He's happy, and he doesn't regret his choices and his decisions. So it's possible that he was a classic recruit, and he started to sell stuff to the Russians. And when it became more dangerous for him, when maybe some things started to point in his direction, he then defected. Because this has happened a lot of times. Americans, Brits, Germans, all these traitors, they try to escape. And so then Edward Snowden, he escapes, goes to Russia, and then he says he all did it because of his conscience. Because he joined intelligence. And they actually were doing intelligence work, and he was outraged by the intelligence work that was being done.
This is all scripted, and it's classic. One of the things, there's a book that's very informative. It's very important for understanding these people, and it's called "Malignant Self-Love: Narcissism Revisited" by Sam
Vaknin.
Yeah, and Vaknin is an Israeli who, he ends up in a jail, and he's saying, "What's wrong with me? Why is my life always blowing up?" And then he realized he became a self-aware narcissist. He says, he tested as, borderline psychopathy, borderline, malignant narcissist. So he decided to look within himself. And this book is like a description of what it's like to be a narcissist by a self-aware narcissist. And of course, the book's been criticized because they're saying, look, this is too nasty. And it is nasty because he says, look, you're eaten away with envy. You want to be all important. You have this thing where you shrink down in size and you feel all miserable and horrible, and you have to feed yourself. You have to feed yourself with self-praise. You need narcissistic supply all the time. And so you are this miserable being who needs to behave in this area. And when you watch his videos, he's got the arrogant demeanor, right, of a narcissist, and he's very much admitting it. But the book is really brilliant because, I knew this KGB guy I got to be friends with, who was a disgruntled former KGB guy who had been assigned at the end of the Cold War to visit all the jails in the West where the people like Felfa were being kept. All the traitors, the spies who'd worked for the Eastern Bloc were kept, and he was to visit them because there was going to be a big exchange at the end of the Cold War. These guys were going to get to leave. And I said, well, what was the common trait of them all? He said they were all egomaniacs. They were all narcissists. They had this malignant self-love, and they were kind of hard to take. And this is what characterized them. And what's interesting, what Vaknin says is that one of the core traits of a malignant narcissist is that they lie all the time, even when they don't have to, which means they are natural spies. They're naturals.
They always put up an act. They're always acting. Yeah. They're always acting. It's always everything is always a performance. It's always a performance. And so there's so many of these cases, and there's new cases all the time. I mean, there were people arrested in America, these young Air Force guys. This is one Air Force guy. He's like 21 years old. Was a big fan of the Russians, and he was believing all this conspiracy buff, new right-wing propaganda on the internet. And he had access, I think, to a SCIF, a secure facility. And he was just stealing documents and hoarding them, and eventually he got himself arrested. And now we hear this stuff about a supposed binder that's missing of intelligence on Russia, from the Trump administration. I mean, it just takes a small number of moles and traitors, and you will end up without a country. I mean, literally, you will end up without a country. Because you cannot play the same game with the Russians that easily, because Russia is a closed society. If you have friends over there, if you have family over there, and you want to visit, you have to register all of it, and there's pre-selection and there's surveillance, and they have so many people to surveil everybody. So you can't just go to Russia and have all this intelligence work being done. There's, as they say, there's Moscow rules. If you have an illegal spy ring in Russia, that's so crazy dangerous. But if they do it to us, I mean, in Germany, they get arrested, they get a prison sentence, maybe 14 years, and after 7 years or 8 years, they're let go or they're being swapped. I mean, and of course, they don't just get payments and money they spend on the new house and the nice car, and everybody in the community loves them and everybody thinks they're so great. They're not just spending the money, they're also trying to hoard the money abroad, or the Russians, they stash money in Russia for these people, a rainy day fund. So if the worst thing that happens to you is like 7-8 years prison, I mean, no wonder people are taking these chances. And also nowadays, because of the rebranding of Russia as, conservative or whatever, nowadays it's not so much it's not so much that you are viewed as a traitor at home. Because let's say you think you're a conservative and you love the Russians, you become a traitor, you get caught, you go to prison, you get swapped. you end up, or you escape, you end up in Russia, you can still play the hero to the audience at home, or as a part of the audience. Because you can say, well, I did it for Jesus, I did it for Putin, I did it for, to fight the evil globalist, satanic child eaters. And so they can be traitors with a lower risk sometimes, not so much in America, because the punishments are harder. But they, in Germany, they can become traitors and they can still try to play the hero.
Yeah, and so that we could see here, I heard Sarah Palin, who ran as vice presidential candidate in the Republican ticket in 2008, her saying I think it was on a Fox News thing years and years ago, that Snowden was a hero, and I've heard conservatives say that, which is shocking, because he betrayed secrets that would have led to the deaths or the arrest of our agents abroad.
Methods. He gave away methods. He gave away structures.
Yeah. And also, more than that, I mean, he had access to, as a contractor with the National Security Agency, he had knowledge of what we knew and how we knew it. And that would also allow the Russians to conceal operations and to realize where their agents were potentially compromised or actually compromised.
I mean, I looked at
that would inevitably lead to deaths, by the way, of our agents.
Or, just terrorists, spies, networks, they change their methods. They change the software, or they don't use software as much, like before the attack against Israel, because that's what we heard, that Hamas was trying to go back to the Stone Age for important communications. They were just delivering stuff on paper and hand-coded and stuff. So they were trying to make their digital footprint as small as possible. And so I looked at, when the case happened, the Snowden case, I looked at this guy's life, and I noticed he wasn't honest when he was a teenager. So he was playing his video games. He loved to play his video games, and he didn't want to go to school. And so I think he was pretending to be so ill and fragile he couldn't finish school. And somehow he convinced the parents and the government or whatever, the teachers, he was dropping out of school. But at the same time, he talked about his love for martial arts. So he wanted to be this martial artist, and then he wanted to join the military and become a super soldier, and he wanted to try out for special forces of some kind. So how does this fit together? So one point, he's, I'm too fragile, I can't go to school.
He's not a weakly, sickly guy who wants to join special forces.
So it's like this what Sam Vaknin calls a inverted or vulnerable narcissist. So it's a narcissist who's not successful. So instead of acting all tough, they can act very vulnerable, but they're trying to get something out of that vulnerability. So, for example, get out of school, he can play his video games, and but then he wants to be a super soldier, and but he couldn't be that because he was too fragile to become a super soldier.
Yeah,
so
and that's one thing you can't pretend to be.
Yeah, and so he wanted to be this super nerd, intelligence nerd. But apparently he wasn't happy with his career, the way things were going. And there were some things going on in his career where he was really not happy overall because he wasn't paid that much. He wasn't really advancing the way he wanted to advance. He wasn't feeling important.
He didn't have a BMW or a Mercedes in his garage.
Yeah, and he wasn't feeling what he wanted to feel. And then he was collecting, stuff. He was collecting information about all of these programs. And now we have another guy. This was in the Wall Street Journal like 2 or 3 days ago. This was an exclusive story. And this is based on sources in American intelligence and British intelligence. It's about the Wirecard case and a man called Jan Marsalek. Now, Americans won't know this, but so Wirecard at some point was a huge company in Germany. This was bigger than all the other banks, and they wanted to be this competitor to the Americans. They wanted to be the new PayPal, or they wanted to be better than PayPal, better than, bigger than Facebook. And so this company didn't really have great programmers. They didn't have really any products to market, but they wanted to be the next big thing. And so this Jan Masalek showed these narcissistic traits. And so they were just inventing these profits and increasing the value of the stock. And so this became a large company. The politicians loved it, and everything seemed fine. And then this company wanted to do business in Russia. They wanted to revamp the metro system, I think it was, in Moscow. Now, of course, the Russians won't let you revamp their metro system in Moscow without vetting you. And so vetting they did. And they probably found out this company was phony. And now this Jan Masalek guy he fled to Russia, and now he's working apparently for the Russians, still working for the Russians. And this report in the Wall Street Journal said it's somewhat probable. Well, the suspicion is this guy was a Russian spy for 10 years. And also his grandfather was a Soviet spy, maybe. That's the suspicion right now. Because documents were found showing that this guy's grandfather was a flaming communist in Austria. And he was working in Austrian police and Austrian intelligence. And so it's this huge maniacal...
The grandfather recruited the grandson?
No, but the grandfather maybe, this is the suspicion right now, the grandfather probably was a spy for the Soviets. And maybe the grandfather recruited Jan Masalek, or maybe this was just a lesser connection, but still people are looking into this right now. And so then we find out that Russian intelligence was apparently using this Wirecard service to pay for operations and to pay assets. So you could imagine this. You could have American citizens receiving payments through Wirecard. They're being issued Wirecard credit cards or Wirecard branded credit cards, and they're getting money, and they're doing operations on American soil. They're spying on people, abducting people, killing people, anything of the sort, and they're being paid through Wirecard. So this is not just a German problem, this is a problem for the Brits, because apparently there were abductions and assassinations in Britain done with Wirecard payments. And also German intelligence was using Wirecard to pay sources. So it's just this cluster disaster of epic proportions. And this guy, this Jan Masalek, who was scamming people with billions, basically, billions that didn't exist. This Jan Masalek, he was never a good programmer. He was never really a genius in that field, but he was apparently good enough to be a traitor, good enough to be a spy, good enough to be a criminal. So that's the people the Russians are looking for. So imagine these kind of guys in America. Some guy starts up an American crypto coin or some kind of scam, and he's discovered by the Russians or he's recruited by the Russians, and then he starts working for them. Or a politician, an FBI agent, or somebody in Homeland Security. Somebody is in trouble. The wife bought furniture that they can't afford, or they can't pay, they can't pay the mortgage or something. And here come the Russians and say, we're going to help you. We're going to help you. We're going to pay you every month. You got to get us information. You got to do stuff for us, and we're going to help you. And we love Trump. That's what the Russians are saying, basically. We love Trump just like you. It's not really treason because we're doing it for Christianity and conservatism and Jesus, and everything is good. So this is the pitch. This is the pitch. You're not really committing treason. You're just fighting the globalists. You're just fighting the evil child-eating Satanists that, you heard about on the internet. This is the sales pitch these days. And people fall for this, obviously. There's also a terrorism case right now in court. It's the biggest terrorism case we've had since, communists in the 70s. People remember that. I mean, the Americans, they had the Weathermen. We also had communist terrorists. They were called the RAF, the Red Army faction. And so they were doing.
And we had the Black Panthers, which was
the
a
Panthers.
Marxist-Leninist, basically violent terrorist organization centered at one point in Oakland, but it's the grandparent of many of them throughout our cities in America now today. And you've got Black Lives Matter, founded by two Marxists, Chinese-trained Marxists.
Yeah,
but to note this ability to recruit people, years ago, you maybe remember the movie The Falcon and the Snowman.
No, I don't remember that one.
Boyce. It was a film. I think John Schlesinger did the film. And Christopher Boyce, who was an expert in falconry and was the son of a former FBI special agent, he got a job with a civilian defense contractor in the Black Vault, which was a secure communications facility. And he got to read these things. And he read something was misrouted. It was a communique about deposing the Australian Prime Minister or something, or it gave that impression. I'm not remembering it that clearly, but Boyce gets disillusioned with America, decides to work for the Soviets. And he develops a friendship with this other guy, and it's this big, it turns out because he's in this secret facility, he's able to read these messages that are being passed by intelligence agencies in the United States, and he can give these highly, highly classified messages directly to the Soviets, which he did. And of course, they got caught. And of course, the film it's a very good film. People should watch it, but it's just an example. And of course, in the US in 1985, they called it The Year of the Spy. And there was a book called Merchants of Treason, which has a list of all the American military officers and contractors that were caught, just the ones that were caught in the United States from like the 50s to the mid 80s. And it's shocking, the number of non-commissioned officers, contractors, and some of them fled to the Soviet Union, like Glenn Michael Souther, who compromised the U.S. Navy's naval nuclear war plan, like where the submarines were going to be when they would be launching against the Soviet Union in a nuclear war, which one of our admirals said that it had war-winning implications for World War III, that Souther gave this information.
Yeah.
And what's amazing is Souther's wife, who divorced him because she thought he was having an affair, reported him to the Office of Naval Intelligence, said, I think my husband's a Marxist. He's always reading Marxist-Leninist books, right? And the Office of Naval Intelligence puts down disgruntled ex-wife.
Yeah.
Right? They don't even investigate. And the guy, and that was, 2 years before he ends up defecting to the Soviet Union. I think he was given the rank of KGB colonel in the KGB, but he did have remorse because he committed suicide in the Soviet Union. I think it was in 87 or 88. I'm not remembering the exact year, but he committed suicide, Glenn Michael Souther. And there's a book about this called The Spy at the Russian Club, which is a fabulous account of this, if anyone's interested in reading about Souther. But there's just an example. And yet there's literally not just a handful of these people, there's dozens and dozens of these people.
Yeah, and it's also possible to false flag recruit someone. So that means just that the Russians, they don't say they are the Russians, or they use a middleman, a cutout. So for example, some American guy, somebody with status, let's say a military officer, someone who's maybe even publicly known to a larger section of the American population. So this American guy with a status, he starts working for the Russians, he becomes a traitor, and that guy can then recruit others but he wouldn't necessarily tell them, hey, I'm working for the Russians and I want to recruit you for the Russians. But he can tell them, I want you to work for me because I represent an American group of patriots and we want to do this and want to do that. So,
Oh, by the way, it's one of the favored ways for the Soviets to recruit Americans, especially conservatives. And this happened in the 70s and 80s, is if they were like evangelical Christians, for example, who support Israel, that they would even call themselves Zionists. The KGB agent will represent himself as a Mossad agent.
mm-hmm.
And that's a false flag recruitment. And this allegedly happened in the case of Congressman Larry McDonald, allegedly, who was killed when Korean airline flight 007 was shot down. And what a source told me was that he was going to turn himself in. He realized that he wasn't helping Israel, that the people who had false flag recruited him were actually KGB.
Yeah,
right?
And I mentioned this earlier in this show. One single listening device in a Hamburg apartment could have prevented 9/11. I kid you not. This is what the files tell us. So if you got even a little mole, a smaller mole, he can shape things. He can remove a bit of information. He can just delay certain things, and then a bigger operation actually happens and can be pulled off. So never underestimate the traitors. And so basically this bigger net of propaganda that is being woven in America, that Russia is your friend, they're going to help you against the satanic baby eating globalists,
elite, satanic Western elites.
The globalists. I mean, this general propaganda out there is already a pitch for people to become traitors. So it's already a recruitment type pitch that is everywhere. It's amplified everywhere. So when the actual recruitment takes place, this works on top of the previous propaganda that was already geared towards recruitment. So it's always, every recruitment kind of works the same. So you have to ask somebody, to become a traitor to his own country, his own government. Now, many times this is not a tough sell on, in terms of ideology, because if you work for a communist government and you hate it, you will gladly betray a communist government. It's just if you have all this propaganda out there, it becomes so much easier to recruit people in the United States and in Europe.
People even are willing to broadcast their willingness to be recruited. I watched what was kind of a shocking interview. Danny Jones, the Danny Jones podcast, interviewed Jack Sarfati, who's an 84-year-old former CIA physicist, and he's very pro-Trump, but he's also kind of soft on Putin. And I was shocked in the interview that he talks about flying saucers. He's been trying to develop anti-gravity technology for the United States, and he in the podcast he threatens to go over to Russia with his secrets, his science, which he did. This is public. And he said there was a civil war going on within the CIA and the U.S. government between communists and other folks. And he doesn't realize that Russia's the bad guys, that they're with the communists, that they're not really on his side. And he described James Angleton, which he refers to as James Jesus Angleton, as a communist mole, quote unquote. This is what Jack Sarfati. Now, Jack Sarfati's this big name as a CIA physicist, and really has his heart in the right place, but he's made these fundamental blunders in this interview with Danny Jones. You can watch it, you just jaw drops open, and you're going, Jack, I love you, man. You're a patriot. He jokingly calls himself a super Jew, you want to do the right thing, but no, 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 the Russians, no, you can't. And to actually be threatening that, oh, they're not paying attention to me. And he talks about who the good guys and bad guys a little bit, naming some names. And some of the guys under Stubblebine, that Colonel John, his name is eluding me, he's an enemy of his. This war within the U.S. intelligence. So it's so beautiful to have people confused and false
Mm-hmm.
flagged by someone. I mean, Putin is a false flag KGB recruitment guy, right?
Yeah, yeah. He ran left-wing terrorists apparently while he was stationed in Dresden, German city of Dresden. Mr. Putin, he was not just running left-wing terrorists; he was also running super right-wing guys as well. And now we have a.
Which right wing guys was Putin? Now let's talk about that for a second. Which right wing guys was he running?
Hang on a second. I'll just bring that right up.
Or was it the Red Brigade? It was the Baader Meinhof gang that stole stereo equipment for him. I remember in
Well,
one biography.
there are multiple generations of the RAF. So some of the later guys, some of the guys they were the later generations. They were apparently tied to Putin's operations in Dresden, and
Yeah.
also and he was also running extreme right wing guys at the time. And this ties into a big scandal. They call it the Saxony Swamp, or as we say, Sachsensumpf. Now, this is, of course, in Saxony. Apparently, the Russians had a whole net of spies in Saxony that survived the fall of the supposed fake fall of the Soviet Union. So they were still running assets in Saxony, and this was also involving these brothels, brothels for important guests, and some of these prostitutes were underage, and this was a big scandal, a big stink over here.
And by the way, this kind of operation using brothels goes back in intelligence work hundreds of years.
Yeah,
And of course, the SD very famously, uh, um, Heydrich, the head of the SD, ran a famous brothel in Berlin for trying to cater to foreign visitors to the Third Reich. So this has been going on. Of course, we have Jeffrey Epstein here in the U.S., who did not survive, who somehow the camera got turned off and the guards were asleep when he strangled himself with his paper tissue, jail blanket.
Oh, and
Supposedly hung
Epstein's French friend colleague from the old days, Mr. Brunel, also mysteriously died, and especially the Brunel operation was tied to Russians as well. There was some Russians involved there.
Yeah, the people want to say that Jeffrey Epstein was Mossad, but again, because of Ghislaine Maxwell's involvement, Maxwell was a member of parliament. He had left Czechoslovakia after the Munich. He became a British citizen famously. But Maxwell, there were people after the fall of the Cold War, KGB people who were saying, and you can find this in certain sources, saying, oh, Maxwell was ours. There were certain missions that happened in the early 90s. And Maxwell died very curiously on his yacht out in the sea. He drowned, if I recall. But it's funny that his daughter shows up as the kind of the madam business partner of Jeffrey Epstein. And I don't, is it Mossad? Is it KGB? Is it both? What is it?
What is the primary? Yeah, what is the primary loyalty? Because somebody can sell information to different intelligence agencies, but but sometimes, when you sell to different agencies, they get really mad at you and they might take you out. But sometimes somebody works primarily for one intelligence agency and then also works for these others, but it's always a betrayal because there's only one key loyalty, one main loyalty involved in all of this.
And like all these things, I mean, my interpretation, I'm going to tend to try to give the argument that the Russians are involved in a lot of this stuff because the Russians are the best service, and people would say, well, I could be making mistakes or my judgment could be skewed a bit on that, but This is my argument, and it comes from Andrei Navrazov, whose father was Lev Navrazov, Stalin's favorite translator from Russian into English. And Navrazov actually worked with Kim Philby after he defected, because Kim Philby worked on translations with Andrei's father. And what really amazed me was that Navrazov said that, look, it's not a conspiracy that the KGB is so good and the GRU are so good in fooling the West. It is a atavism. It is an inheritance. There's a culture. Everybody has a culture, and the culture of the Tsarist regime and the Soviet regime is that you keep your thoughts to yourself because you don't want to get into trouble saying something that's not permitted, having opinions that are not approved by the authorities. So that changes the personality of the average Russian, and that makes him not only very careful and guarded, and able to keep secrets, by the way, and making oneself more secretive in your own personal life on a daily basis, but it makes you more suitable as a spy. And it also means that if you have a culture of domestic spying and foreign spying, that culture then develops over hundreds of years, and you develop talents. Psychologically, you develop differently. Now compare that to Americans or West Germans now. People wear their opinions on their sleeves. They think nothing of telling people their deepest thoughts.
Yeah.
They reveal things about themselves that they shouldn't, right? Because there's no consequences in the West, at least not yet. Well, it's starting to be, right? We're getting into the political correctness, and people are being punished in the recent years. But yet it's deeply ingrained in us culturally to be honest about what we think.
So,
which does not make it for a very good spy, does it?
Yeah. I mean, some people probably have seen this old video presentation of I think it was Yuri Bezmenov, a defector, and he's drawing. I think he's drawing stuff on a board, and he explains this multi-stage strategy to get a target country into complete trouble. So you just make everybody hate.
He calls it.
Yeah, and make everybody hate everybody until people start fighting each other, and then you may have the option to change the system. And so back in the day, for example, Vladimir Putin, when he was was working for the KGB in Dresden in Germany, Vladimir Putin himself was running an asset named Rainer Sonntag. And he grew up in Eastern Germany, so he was just a common criminal, who was always in prison. He wanted to escape.
Mr. Sunday.
Yeah, Mr. Sunday, and he wanted to escape.
That's kind of funny.
He wanted to escape Soviet Germany, which was illegal. You couldn't leave. They wouldn't let you out. So he was caught. He was put in prison, and he was eventually recruited. First to spy on people around him, and then he actually became a West German neo-Nazi leader. So magically, with the help of Mr. Putin, he was becoming one of the most powerful neo-Nazis in Western Germany, and then the unified Germany, I think, as well. And so. He was becoming second in command to the boss, basically, the boss Nazi. This is trying to find the year.
This was a skinhead or an outright Nazi group in Germany? What is this group?
Those were neo-Nazis, so more well-dressed guys. He was under Mr. Kühnen. He was a big star at the time. This Kühnen organization also had ties to America. There was a what they call it, a National Socialist support organization of some kind, and they were trying to network with the American neo-Nazis heavily at the time. And so this Kühnen guy selects Mr. Sonntag as his right-hand man. And Mr. Sonntag is run by, Vladimir Putin, the KGB. And then the boss, Mr. Kühnen, suddenly becomes ill with AIDS and he dies. And of course, that made Mr. Sonntag the new boss. And so that's one of that was that case. And and then of course some guy, a Mr. Z, let's just call him Mr. Z. He was working for the Soviets. He defected to the West, and he was giving up some of the assets and networks. And Mr. Z was then attacked in a train. Some guy stabbed him with something, and just basically took off. And then Mr. Z became really, really ill. So this was probably some kind of poison. He was stuck with some kind of poison. So this is kind of the stuff that was going on in Germany. And
was there any association with this group with David Irving?
I think they knew Irving at the time. I'm not so sure if they had direct contact with him, but it's the prominent people, they at least knew each other. And I also did some stuff on the connection to America, to the United States. And then, of course, at some point, they all became fans of Alexander Dugin and this new national Bolshevism thing. And so, obviously, the Russians tried to infiltrate the right wing and then turn them pro-Russia and pro-Dugin, pro-Bolshevism. But the Russians, they're still working the left wing. And so this is kind of the strategy for Germany and also for the United States. You try to instill these crazy right-wing ideas into people. Right-wing ideas and also left-wing ideas. And then you get the left and the right fight each other. And so what I've seen over the last few years in America was this. You saw the right wing or parts of the right wing in America move away from Constitution and Americana. They're moving into an extreme direction where they believe the Earth is flat, and they're hunting Satanist baby eaters everywhere. They're doing witch hunts. Everybody who disagrees with them is a globalist, asset, and it's becoming so crazy. And at the same time, the left is becoming more and more crazy. So this is kind of what Bezmenov described as this multi-stage strategy of turning people against each other, because if people go for this extreme right-wing stuff, they will then activate or reactivate the left or make them go more crazy. Because they think, well, we got to do anti-fascism now because fascism is spreading in America. So they're going into this extreme direction. And just people separate from each other. There's splits going right through a family. Some of these people believe in the Q stuff and they become crazy about it. And these young kids, they watch the right wing and they say, "Oh my God, this is so crazy! I want to be as woke and as left as I possibly can, and love all the migrants and have more migrants and have all this leftist language and stuff." And then
you've got the other extreme where the Muslim migration into Europe is causing people to move to the extreme right.
Exactly. So
which is fascinating because we know. I know from a study that I did with a Romanian writer a few years ago for the Center for Security Policy that Putin was involved in engineering the million Muslims that went into Europe in what was it around 2014?
Yeah.
And when this bombing in Syria was driving people out, and the Russian special services, the Russian mafia, the Turks and others were involved in helping to smuggle all those people into the heart of Europe.
I mean, it was Chancellor Angela Merkel, who grew up in communism. She had the option. This was I think it was 2015 or something. She had the chance to close the German border. This was according to the law, this was also doable. And so everybody's waiting. So the police was getting ready, especially in Bavaria, because we're the southern border. The Bavarian border in the south is the border of Germany. So everybody was ready. Okay, we're going to close the border. So the migrants, they can move through Austria, but they're going to stop at the German border, and we won't be responsible for them. But then in the last minute, Chancellor Merkel, she modified the order for the police. I think it was something like when these people, well, if these people call for asylum, you have to let them through. Something of that nature. So not close the border, open the border, and that's when this all happens. So this was the biggest push for the new right-wing party in Germany. So they were terrible in the polls. Nobody really cared about them. They had too many troubles, and they were too far extreme right-wing. But this influx of migrants, it just made their poll numbers just balloon, go nuts. And for the next couple of years, up until this day, some of these extreme right-wingers, they were hoping for Muslim terror. They were hoping for sex crimes by refugees, because every time this happens...
These are pro-Russian right-wingers. These are pro-Putin right-wingers.
Exactly. Yeah. So every time there's somebody killed or raped by refugees, this would help, the right-wingers in the polls.
So here's how the Russians play it. They've got their friends on the left who want the socialist stuff and want no weapons to be built in Germany, and want the country to build the pipelines going to Russia. And then by them just allowing the Muslims in and being the bad guys, they fuel this right wing that the Russians have thoroughly infiltrated that are pro-Putin.
Yeah.
Whereas the people actually that were working for... So it's like Putin's in Dresden still, and he's got his right-wing spies and his left-wing spies, and now they're dominating German politics from both ends of the political spectrum.
Yeah, and imagine, and imagine if something like 9/11, on the scale of 9/11 or bigger, happens in Germany, this could shift the entire balance. This could completely, everything would be up in the air. I mean, one terror attack, and I told this, I told the story, I think twice now in this episode. One listening device could have prevented 9/11. One listening device in a Hamburg apartment. People knew these were, or suspected these were terrorists. One listening device could have prevented 9/11. So what if moles actually, right now, are protecting terrorists? So a big event happens, and then what? And then the Russians will benefit from that, because then they will say, the pro-Putin guys were right from the start. These, it's just this exactly what we thought would happen. Refugees committed this atrocity, and now Germany will be different, completely different from now on. And this, it
so
all
what,
takes.
What do you think what does the AfD say about NATO and about the war in Ukraine? Give us the typical. What is it that they say?
At first, they said. At first, the position was, if I remember correctly, we're going to stay in NATO, but we also want to have a partnership with the Russians. So we're going to have our cake and eat it. It's going to be both. We're just going to have both. And then it shifted towards, let's get out of NATO. We just want to leave NATO. And this is, I think, now the dominant position of these people. So
if the AfD forms a government in the future, you think that Germany will leave NATO?
Well, if the AfD has significant control, I think they will absolutely leave NATO. I mean, the first thing they do would be to leave NATO and have a ready-made partnership with the Russians for economics, for buying gas and selling stuff to them, and security relationship with the Russians, and all of it. I mean, this would probably be the first thing they do. And so with the Ukraine thing, I mean, they were all surprised because I think they're just not smart enough, or they were not in the loop, so to say. So there were so many of these pro-Russian guys who were adamant about Ukraine before the invasion. There's not going to be an invasion. Are you crazy? You just this silly idea, that Russia would actually invade. And then the invasion happened, and the first thing the right-wingers did, or the extreme right-wingers did, was to stay silent, just wait for the narrative. And then the Russians would put out this narrative, and suddenly these right-wingers were just repeating that narrative. And there's this one catch. There's a law in Germany, and I think this is kind of unified now in all of Europe. You cannot actively, directly promote a war of aggression. So Russia invades Ukraine, and if you say, I like this, then you get into trouble. So this is a crime. You cannot say, I like this, I think this is awesome. That's illegal. But there's a way around it. You can have a short disclaimer sentence, and this is apparently what they did. They said, well, it is an illegal invasion, but, and after the word "but" come all these justifications, all these excuses. So it's just this one little disclaimer, and you can actually say these things. And so this became this narrative of it's all NATO's fault. NATO was threatening Russia, which is nonsense. And so so the Russians are kind of they're just doing this, and we just want to buy gas from them. We want to buy gas from them.
Since Scholz was always a creature of the Soviet structures and of Soviet Germany,
he could have prevented 9/11 with a single listening device while he was a senator in Hamburg.
Right, but now we have the war in Ukraine. So Scholz is posturing like he's with NATO, he's with the Americans, he's supporting the Ukrainians, kind of, and he's of course against the AfD. They're the enemy domestically. How does he play this off? I mean, does anybody point out, hey, wait a minute, you were a creature of Moscow your whole career? Does nobody dare point that out?
I think it was the Ukrainian ambassador who at some point finally lost his patience, and he said that there was he called it a spider's web in the Socialist Democratic Party here. I think he called it a spider's web, and he said, well, this Steinmeier guy, this Scholz guy, and 20 other guys, they were so pro-Russia, and this is just a disaster. And he got into trouble for saying that. The
Ukrainian ambassador got into trouble for telling the truth about the Social Democratic Party.
Exactly. So, I mean, even before 2014, I mean, this was like in 2012, there were books coming out, German authors like Jürgen Roth, and he was already warning everybody about, Gazprom, the Russians, the Social Democrats here. He was laying it all out in 2012 or 2011 or something. And he had some court cases with the Social Democrats because he was saying, I think, according to my information, the Social Democrats, they actually knew Putin earlier. Even going back further than what they said. So he got into trouble with that.
Some of them had actually met him when he was a KGB guy in Dresden.
Well, this is where it gets kind of murky because there's there's the banks in former Soviet Eastern Germany, and there's all these political connections, and so this guy was warning everybody, and he also quoted from German foreign intelligence reports, which he magically received. Thank the Lord. And he was quoting these files, and they were saying, yeah, we know about this, we know about that, it's horrible, this is horrible, the Russians are doing this, the Russians are doing that. So if the Foreign Intelligence Service knew, the government must have known, because they are the recipients for this intelligence. They are the intelligence customers. So he was warning everybody, even before 2014 and Crimea. And so when the ambassador said this from Ukraine, this was treated like a scandal. And so at first, I think the Social Democrats thought this war was going to be over quickly. So they were just sitting on their hands and just waiting what the situation was going to be like. And then
same thing in Washington with Biden, by the way. They didn't lift a finger the first month and a half of that war to do anything to help Ukraine.
And then then the Social Democrats, they started to send things to Ukraine. It started with helmets, it started with blankets. And I was double checking this. They were emptying German military resources, and they were sending all that German stuff to the Ukrainians, and they magically forgot to order new stuff for the German troops, the German army. So they were sending certain tanks to Ukraine, but they didn't really order new tanks. And then,
so it's a double catastrophe if Ukraine loses the war, because
we're
NATO
empty.
countries were supporting Germany, for example, supporting Ukraine by destroying their own arsenal.
Yep.
Without filling it back up again, which is what has been happening in Europe, as if, magically the Ukrainians are just going to win, right? Because we give them all their stuff and we don't need to replace their stuff. So basically, when the Russians are fighting the Ukrainians, they're basically fighting all of NATO, which is actually being drained.
Yeah, I mean, so this was kind of this weird dog and pony show. So we'll give the Ukrainians the Leopard tank. Okay, sounds nice, right? It's a late Cold War era tank, but it's a decent tank. They could have made another tank. They should have made another tank in between.
Yeah, the Leopard 1 is the older one, and the Leopard 2 is the newer one.
Yeah, so they promised both types to Ukraine, sent both types, but
and I think they've given some. I think they've been using some of them.
So you have to imagine the Leopard 1 is really old. I mean like really Cold War old. And they made a couple of thousand of them. And then the second model, the Leopard 2, they didn't make as many of those, and then they really stopped making them. And so this was a late Cold War era design, the two model. Late Cold War.
And look at the Abrams tank, which we've promised, and I don't know that the Germans have actually received delivery of them. We promised 30. Big number, right?
Yeah.
It is a pretty old tank. It's a very good tank, better than what the Russians are using, but it's a really old piece of armor.
Yeah. And of course, there's all this stuff that goes with it. So, for example, the Abrams, it needs, I think it runs on gasoline, not diesel. So it's a whole different ball game. It needs different parts, different experts. The Leopard 2. You cannot just send over these tanks. You need the mechanics, you need the parts, you need all kinds of support vehicles. And so these were in storage, and they're not in good condition oftentimes. Or these tanks were they had issues, they had problems, and so it's not like a magic gift for the Ukrainians. It was just. And everything was moving so slow, and the replacements were not ordered, and the replacement ordering process will take 6 months to a year, and then actually making them takes another 18 months. And so we were draining, or the Social Democrats, they were draining German resources, moving that stuff to Ukraine, but we don't see we don't see great replacements here. We don't have ammo, we don't really have the equipment, and there was money promised, 100 billion, which wasn't really going to do that much. But even this promised money wasn't really spent. So we're been
talking
drained.
About a war on a very big scale. I mean, this war in Ukraine is involving 600,000 Ukrainian defenders, and probably 400,000 Russians on the Russian side, maybe more. We don't know the exact Russian numbers. And this war is now approaching the end of its second year now. In another 2 months, it's going to be, just about there, 2 years.
Yeah, and it's like this propaganda in America where people say, well, it's the globalists, these baby-eating devil worshippers. They wanted to attack Russia, and so we're supposed to abandon Ukraine. But then, if Ukraine falls, we're empty. Germany has been drained. We're next. Poland is next. So what's the propaganda going to be like? What's the propaganda going to be like in America? Oh, well, Poland is not really our concern. Germany is not really our concern. So the Russians take it all.
Yeah, yeah. By the way, if you get to, selling Ukraine out is one thing, and it is damaging enough because the message it sends. But if you sell out Ukraine and you have allowed they know this war is going on. They know if Ukraine falls, you're going to have a problem in Europe because Europe's defenses are actually weaker than Ukraine's.
Yeah. Oh, and here's another
thing. America has this problem with China in the Pacific. So America's committed to defending Japan and South Korea and maybe Taiwan and Australia, certainly. And that's a huge commitment because China's got more troops, more ships, more aircraft than Russia. That's a bigger security problem than even Russia.
Yeah, and here's another thing. So right now there's a group of extreme right-wingers in prison in Germany. So this is not your ordinary type right-wing group that's been busted, but this is a very, 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 very interesting, dangerous group. So they are very pro-Russia, they are very pro-Trump, and so they've been in prison for a year, and now the official indictments are finished. So this is the next step of the judicial process, and so this group consisted of former military experts. They had weapons, they had money. One of the members was from the German parliament in Berlin. And so this group had access to the parliament, to the Reichstag building in Berlin. And this group they have supporters. They have people that like what they stand for, or had people that like what they stand for. And so the allegations are that this is a terrorist organization. They wanted to storm our Capitol building, our Reichstag building, take hostages, and call out a new government. And so then what we know now is that that the leader of the group, who is actually a legit prince from the nobility here.
Yes, I remember reading about him.
Prince Reuss, from a very old family. And so this guy gave, as far as we know, he gave a letter, I think, to one of his people, and that person gave the letter to another person who has Russian contacts. And I think he's now in Russia, and he's always visits Russia. And so this letter was asking for, that's what it sounds like to me. It was asking for Russian support. So now this becomes more interesting because it's not
Russian support for what is essentially a coup against the German government.
Exactly. And this is now the major court case that's coming up. It's probably the largest court case since the old days of the RAF. Now, the left-wing RAF terrorists,
the Red Brigades,
the Red Army faction, they attacked German targets. They also attacked American targets in Germany. They wanted to create this.
They killed American servicemen with bombs.
Exactly. And they had like millions of sympathizers, a couple of million of sympathizers in Germany. And so they had grand ideas. They wanted to destabilize everything and then have some sort of a revolution. And of course, at the time, Germany was split. So the communist part of Germany, they had basically an invasion type army. So they had these bunkers along the internal German border. They had these command bunkers equipped with computers that could organize a large invading army. So this was always in the cards that these terrorists would do attacks, and then also a special group would enter Western Germany, special sabotage group, cause more chaos, and then the invading army would
Yeah,
come.
there was a large Soviet group of armies along with the East German army. Then you had the Hungarian and Polish armies behind them. That would be the first strategic echelon in a war with NATO. This was described to me. Colonel Lunev described the strategy to me years ago. He said the first strategic echelon drives over the NATO
Yeah,
tactical nuclear minefields in West Germany. The second strategic echelon comes up and then exchanges tactical
yeah,
nuclear weaponry with
yeah.
NATO, destroying the fort. And the third strategic echelon then goes straight through Germany, through France and the rest of Europe, all the
Mm.
way to the English Channel and to the Strait of Gibraltar.
And just
And
so
that was their
Yeah,
strategy. Yeah.
and just so Americans really understand this, if the Russians take Germany, they can use and expand this industrial powerhouse. Now, especially the Social Democrats, over the last decades, especially the Social Democrats, but not just them, they sort of toned down the German economy, with the restrictions on the cars, and there's so much production of parts and pieces and expertise, and you can use a lot of those facilities for military production. So you can make, planes and tanks and ships
Yes.
and stuff.
And
So
Germany's technologically one of the most advanced countries technologically in the
yeah,
world.
and so if Germany had chosen, if Germany had chosen to do so, they could have built a significant military force, and Germany could
And of
also have
course, they could equip Germany, I mean, they could equip Russia in the future
yeah.
with first rate equipment to make the Russian army truly dangerous in a
Yeah,
way that it is not now as
yeah.
dangerous.
Because right now, America has the upper hand in terms of production and established.
Conventional military equipment.
Yeah, so
Although
it's
you have to understand, American conventional armaments, we have not built the plants. This is coming out, reports are
yeah,
coming out in the United States showing we could not sustain a conventional war beyond so many weeks
yeah.
because we have not built the plants. We can't make the spare parts. We can't supply the equipment to the troops for a sustained ground war.
Yeah, the
And
what
now,
was it? It was in the I think it was in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, or some other papers as well, where they talked about the American production lines for was it these smaller rocket engines and all these precision pieces, and production was scaled down so bad over the last decades because supposedly communism fell, so why would you need this production? And so
right.
yeah, this is a
And, and,
problem.
and we outsource so much to China.
Yeah,
So much of our industry, we
and so
deindustrialize.
And so, my dear Americans, imagine what would happen if if Russia actually takes over Germany, and they get their hands on all this production. So they don't make Mercedes cars, and they don't make this and don't make that, but instead they make military goods, and they could in some aspects, maybe they could even then outproduce America, at least for a while. So this would become an American problem. So
Absolutely.
it's just insane what the propaganda has become in America. If you listen to these people, just abandon Ukraine. It's not our concern. It's just
Yeah.
if Ukraine wins, then the globalists win, and the
You've got
Ukraine will
all
become
these
gay.
right-wing celebrities that are like
Yeah,
Jordan Peterson,
yeah,
like Marjorie Taylor Greene, like General Douglas McGregor and the convicted child molester Scott Ritter. All of these people, these famous people on the right in America, are pro-Russian, or they're anti-Ukrainian. They're anti-supporting Ukraine, not, and they're strategic illiterates. All of them are
yeah.
strategic illiterates,
Yeah, and I
basically.
mean, there's internet influencers who have quite the following, and they know next to nothing. They don't know Russia. They don't know militaries. They don't know intelligence. They know nothing, absolutely nothing. They just listen to these popular talking points. Okay, how's the wind blowing? What direction is the wind blowing? Oh, okay, abandon Ukraine. Abandon Ukraine. Just sell stuff to
Yeah.
the Russians and buy gas from the Russians.
Another narrative, and this goes to the bad education we were talking about the counterintelligence game. It's all a seamless whole with the propaganda. And one of the things is Americans, you got a lot of right-wing Americans talking against the central bank idea, against the Fed. What they don't understand is that you can't have a war machine. Of course, they're against the war machine, which is protecting them, keeping them alive.
Yeah.
You can't have a war machine without central banking because you have to be flexible in your money supply in order to meet a military emergency. Well, one of the things that's happened after the Cold War is the United States
Oh, by the way,
to hold people.
before I forget it,
Yeah,
the Russians did actually try to copy the Federal Reserve System with this Nabirulina woman. They did try to copy the Western system. They have
sure.
the central bank in Russia. I try to explain that to people. They copied like a Western central bank system, and they also have these large phony merchant banks over there, and they try to emulate Western banks with that.
Yeah, and the thing is because it works and it's efficient. And one of the things is that people say, "Oh, it's dishonest, it's whatever." But do you realize that you live better than your grandparents? That your standard of living is higher than the people before you. If fractal banking was meant to pauperize you, why aren't you pauperized? Why aren't you completely destroyed already? So it's a much more complicated issue. And so, but the thing is that's happened here is that they're against it. But what's happened is that, and this is what people don't understand about the American dollar. The United States allowed its allies in World War II, like Japan, like South Korea, even Taiwan and Germany, to export to us, to have an economic, because we controlled, when World War II ended, all the economies around the world were collapsed by the war. Ours was the only economy, everything was made in America. We were the big manufacturing hub for everything. We were supplying all the major powers of the war on the Allied side with weapons and supplies and food and everything. I mean, America was the core of the world economy. More than 50% of the gross national product of the entire world was then in America in 1945 because of the collapse caused by the war. So here America emerges. And so what we do is we have to let all these other countries, we let the South Koreans make shoes. So the American shoe industry collapsed, for one example. We had to make the Germans and Japanese allow them to make cars, right? Because if we don't allow them to
Yeah.
be productive and have a piece of the economic pie, they'll go over to the communists. I mean, this was debated by the Eisenhower administration. We have to do this. And so the system we set up ultimately was they all need to use dollars to trade in. And, people here will say, "Oh, that's unfair. America's ripping off all these countries." No, that's the tax everybody pays for us to defend them. They support the dollar by, you buy oil and petrodollars, you buy other things and all the trading. So there's this constant need abroad for the American dollar, so that American inflation is cast off on all the other countries that are using dollars as well, so that we can export our inflation basically, which pays for a lot of what we do in America and allows our high standard of living, allows guns and butter here.
Yeah.
That's what a
And
lot
it's
of
a,
Americans don't understand. But if we don't defend Poland, right? If we don't defend Ukraine, and then
yeah.
we're not able to defend Poland, the dollar, then they say, well, why should we support the dollar as a trading? This is what Saudi Arabia is doing by abandoning the petrodollar, which is
Yeah.
happening in phases. What's that gonna do? All those dollars that are being used abroad are gonna come flooding where? Back to America.
Yeah.
They're gonna
And
push up prices. What's that called? Inflation. And now you can have hyperinflation as the dollar erodes away and collapses, because we're refusing to defend people, because that's the economic arrangement.
yeah. And who was the big guy in the media? Uh, just well, remember Ron Paul,
Oh
who
yes,
was
Ron
very pro
Paul, the
Russia,
libertarian.
who was very pro Russia, and he always tried to make a big thing out of the Federal Reserve. So he wanted to abolish
Yeah,
the Federal Reserve, audit it, then end it, and stuff like that. And he was always talking about foreign involvement of the United States, and he was always talking about foreign military bases of the United States. And he essentially wanted to, well, remove America from the world stage and just to have it contained. and then not have central banking, and
Does he realize that the United States has been defending about 40 countries?
yeah.
That's why we have so many foreign military bases, because we have these treaty obligations to defend all these people, and these people
Yeah.
want us to defend them because they don't. If they're responsible for their own defense, they're not sure they can actually meet the responsibility
Yeah. And
because
at
they
some
don't
point,
have nuclear weapons.
yeah, and at some point, I mean, you talked about this in the episode about, I think it was about the nuclear war handbook, how nuclear war is fought and what the Russian strategies was. And you said that the Russians, I mean, we know the plans. I mean, some of the plans are now declassified. The Russians wanted to take over Western Europe, build up what they needed, and then attack the United States. And even though there's a Second Amendment in the United States and there's like 250 million modern firearms in the United States, still the danger for America would increase exponentially. So it's just a way of being involved in the world for their own safety.
It's self-protection for the U.S. because yeah. It's not like we can withdraw. See, this is the people, they go to George Washington and they say, George Washington's farewell address very famously said, do not have foreign entanglements because you'll be drawn into Europe's wars. Well, that made perfect sense in the 1790s to say that. But that doesn't, and it made sense during the Civil War, it made sense during much of our history. But when you got into the fact that the British Empire collapses, now we're responsible for freedom of the seas. Now we're responsible for the security of all these countries when Stalin's Russia appears preeminent and with nuclear weapons, and the communist movement appears. There's nobody else in the world that could perform this role. So then it behooves the communists to say, hey, remember George Washington? Well, right now you got conservatives from this same group wanting we need America a divorce between the red states and the blue states. We need America to break apart. Texas is already looking at separating, from the Union because of the way it was brought into the Union as one of two states, I think, that has the option to leave. But the thing is, this is the interesting part is Washington in that same farewell address said that if anybody talks about dividing you, that dividing the country into two sections or more than two sections, they are your enemy, is what Washington said, the father of our country.
I would recommend that people read a book. It's called Wages of Destruction. It's an analysis of exactly why the National Socialists in Germany, why exactly they attacked Poland and why they took Czechoslovakia and why they made those choices and why they made those choices at the time. So it's a study about basically the Nazi economics before the attack and after the attack. So to give you the short version, this was a calculation by the National Socialists. So they figured if we stay within our borders, we will lose. We will probably collapse as a force, as an empire within a couple of years. So we don't have the space. We have lots of farming, and we need space for that farming. It's important to the economy. The Americans are making better products than we are, and they're making them faster and they're making them cheaper. And so at the time, the lowest paid guy at a Ford automotive plant, the lowest guy at Ford could afford a 4-room apartment, with running water and central heating and stuff. And so for the Germans, this was unreachable. So this was out of their league basically. And so the idea was, if we stay within our borders, we're going to collapse and we lose our chance at the big game. So the other option is we attack Poland, we get Czechoslovakia, we take what we want, and this is our only chance of staying in the game. That's what the choice was, because they ran the numbers. There's always a calculation. And the same parallel, the parallel is Russia. The parallel in my view, is Vladimir Putin. He is now in that, Hitler, I have just attacked Poland stage. Well, the Nazis were more successful with Poland, of course, because the Nazis used I think it was 1.5 million soldiers, and they used two main attack groups, not 4 or 5.
They had 2 panzer armies, or panzer groups. Yeah,
and they also heavily used, the Nazis also heavily used their own air force to gain air superiority as fast as possible. But still,
they smashed the Poles with their air force.
But Putin right now is in that Hitler, I've just attacked Poland stage. And this was also kind of a calculation by the Russians, because they need the Russians. They ran their own calculations, and they figured they need the population, absolutely need the population of Ukraine, and they need the industry
and the know-how of the Ukrainians, because so many Ukrainians are educated and are engineers and scientists.
And they make rockets. They made the intercontinental rockets for the Russians. They made the submarines for the Russians, the airplanes for the Russians, the Navy ships for the Russians. The Ukrainians also made helicopter engines and all this stuff, because this industrial base was built in Soviet times. So the Russians cannot do without the stuff in Ukraine and the people of Ukraine. So the decision was made: we're gonna take this stuff to stay in the game, to remain competitive. And of course, the big prize is Germany, because then they really have what they need, to take on America. Because right now, in the industrial sense, Russia is not doing so well. They had huge problems making their own missiles, making their own helicopter engines, making their own, complex things made from bits, and then bits are made from other bits, and so on. The Russians, they just can't do it, and so they needed to take.
I've been told by some Ukrainians that really Putin's mishandled Ukraine in the 2014 in the Euromaidan revolution. They basically lost Ukraine, and all these Ukrainian companies that were licensed to work with Russia and support the Russian military complex, those relationships were broken off largely. Yeah. And this was extremely damaging. And you think back now, this is 9 years ago. And they have to get that back. Now, they may not be able to, because a lot of these Ukrainians are going to flee. They're going to go to Germany. They're going to go
and move production.
They need Germany. Yeah, they need to go further.
Yeah, exactly. Because this was a big secret, of course, over the course of the Ukraine invasion. What exactly are the Russians destroying? What about the industry of specific industries of Ukraine? And so you saw very scanned reports, some misleading statements in the press, and then there was, I think it was the Wall Street Journal or some other paper. They did report on some of the Ukrainian production being moved further west, sometimes even into Poland, and so they're trying to save those assets. They move the production, and so this is why the Russians apparently are committing more and more soldiers to this war. They cannot let this go, because now the price has shrunken, or the goalposts have been moved. They have to go further to get the stuff that they ultimately need.
Yeah. And thus Putin talking about, maybe Poland is not a sovereign country.
Yeah,
maybe
of course.
Maybe they're the next ones. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the goalposts have certainly moved, and the Russians did the same kind of calculations that the Nazis did. So they were running these projections. What are we going to be like in 5 years, or in 10 years, or in 20 years? And when the answer is...
Or next summer, when the Russian army finally reaches NATO's border, when Ukraine collapses, because we are not now sending them the resources they need to continue to defend themselves.
So if the projections say we're going to be toast in 10 years, or we're going to be toast in 20 years, then the decision is it more risky to attack Ukraine, or is it more risky to not attack Ukraine? And so when that decision is made, of course they have to put out a false narrative, but they also had to make it look like Vladimir Putin made this decision by himself
Right,
out of some
right.
personal ambition or some personal mood. Because they cannot reveal this is all just a calculation. We want to stay in the game and we need
Yeah.
Europe. We
Yeah,
cannot do without it.
it isn't just about Vladimir Putin, which all of these people, especially on the left, want to make it about his personality. And this is the thing, we were talking about the espionage systems and the education system. If you think about it, everything has been prepared in terms of our intellectual disarmament through the school systems in Germany and the United States and France and the UK. We have been disarmed, intellectually disarmed. And of course, our espionage system has been penetrated and colonized. Our political system, both in Germany and the United States, colonized. So
Yeah.
now the war begins. And you see that although the Russians thought they were going to win quickly in Ukraine, okay, they made a misstep, they could then unwind their mistake by using their colonized systems in the West to gradually, all right, West, just listen to us. Let go of Ukraine now, just very gently. Don't give yourselves away, Mr. Biden, Mr. Scholz, you know, and allow us to have it. Okay, now we're getting it. All right, good,
Yeah.
good
Yeah.
doggy, good little friends, little helpers.
So,
And that's where we are right now.
I mean, I personally have to get involved. I have to be involved in, the education of my kids. Because when they learn for a test, for example, my daughter, she's 13 years old. She's learning for a test in history, and it's about the post, era of the French Revolution, Napoleon, and all these other empires. So she has to learn about that, but. She's trying to learn the stuff from a school book, and she's not understanding anything about what was really going on. So I have to keep asking these questions. Well, why do you think the French had this? The French had this economic blockade against Britain. Well, I don't know. Well, to deprive them of their base to wage war. So this is why the ports were closed to these British merchant ships. And so then I keep asking these questions. So why do you think when Napoleon had to leave Russia with the paltry rest of his army, why didn't he raise a new army? Why couldn't he attack right away? Because he said he was going to do that, but he knew he couldn't. Why couldn't he? So the answer being, the horses were gone, the officers were gone.
The horses died in Russia in the cold.
It takes years. It takes
Yeah.
years to rebuild. You cannot just raise another 300,000 young men and train them in 2
No.
weeks and have all these horses ready in 2 weeks. So you just keep asking these questions. Why is this? Tell me,
Yeah,
what do you
why
think?
is
What?
this? Well, I think it was 1990. I was teaching at Anaheim Union School District, and it was a senior U.S. government class, and it was second period, which is when they do the announcements. They call it homeroom. It was the homeroom class, and I noticed in this class that when they did the Pledge of Allegiance, because in American schools during homeroom you have the announcements and everybody stands up and there's a flag in every classroom and they put their hand on their heart. They pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of
Yes.
America. They do the pledge, and it's from grade school. This is what we grew up with. And they weren't standing for the pledge. They were just sort of chatting with each other. So I decided to challenge them. And I told the students, I said, well, I noticed nobody said anything about the Pledge of Allegiance. It's a U.S. government class. It's part of the class. Really, it should be. And I said, why did you do that? Why didn't you stand for the flag? And they said, well, the country's stupid, the flag is stupid, and we don't need it, and it's bad in the military-industrial complex, and all that stuff, that their other teachers had probably been teaching them. And I said, well, I said, well, then what happens, as you have no regard for your country, what happens if China bombs and invades the United States? What do you do then? And one boy in the back said, my mom says if there's a war, I'm going to Canada.
No, really?
And the other boys were saying, yeah, I'm going to go to Canada if there's a war. And I go, so you're just going to leave the girls to be raped by the Chinese soldiers?
Oh, wait a minute.
Suddenly this light went on in the girl's mind. It's like,
Wait, they're gonna
wait a
run? They're
minute,
gonna leave us?
the boys are going to run away and they're not going to defend us from the Chinese soldiers. The very next day, they began standing for the Pledge of Allegiance
Yeah,
in the
common.
class,
Yeah,
right? Common
yeah,
sense. So this was my teaching method, and it was like I had not been in high school myself for more than 10 years. It had changed. I graduated from high school in 1976. The bicentennial of the American Constitution, class of '76. They so that it was 14 years later. This is what it had become.
yeah, yeah.
None of
So
us would have thought of not standing for
it's
the
just
flag salute when I
it's
was
just
in high school.
baseline. It's
Nobody.
just this, yeah, this baseline stuff, the fundamentals, how things work, what's gonna happen if this happens, or what's this gonna turn into. It's just you have to be involved in the education of your kids, because otherwise they cannot judge anything. They cannot judge anything really, and so I just keep asking those questions, and of course there's a difference between boys and girls on average. I mean, my daughter is different than my son. My son is more militaristic, not because we made him that way. It's just who he is, because we try to involve.
Boys are more interested in guns, more interested in competition, more
I try,
interested in
yeah.
fitness.
We bought the girls' toys, but not just the girls' toys for my daughter. We also try to get her into some shooting toys, some this. You want to try this, and guess what? She became a fan of some of the better movies out there. Just female heroes working with guys together and just fighting the bad guys and stuff. But I wouldn't imagine her to seek a military career. It's just not who she is. But I have to be involved and get her closer to reality. But my son is just he was. I mean, he could be a general one day. If he's kind of the type, and always interested and always just fascinated with these things. And I see this all the time when other boys visit. When other boys are over to visit, we have to be extra careful. We have to basically have a pre-plan. Me and my wife. Okay, who are these parents again? Oh yeah, they're these. They're pretty much against cool toys. So we have to hide the toy guns. We have to hide this and that. And so, okay, what games can they play? What video games can they play? Can they play this? Can they play that? So we have to be prepared, because these other parents, they are just detached from reality. They want to raise their boys to be, I don't know what they're expecting them to be. And they
Little
have this.
girls?
It's just they have this Marxist idea that goes back to these German scientists. They believe a
Right.
child is a blank slate, and you just fill that kid with Marxism, and then it will be a nice person. And so there's no biology involved. There's no innate things, and so we have to basically be aware of at all times, who's visiting and what the parents are like, and then these discussions at school. Some of these parents, they think if your kids play with guns or with toy guns or anything, if they're interested in pop culture or even history that's involves warfare. They think this leads to an antisocial personality. Just
Yeah,
a
they
violent.
do. Yes.
I try to. Sometimes I sneak in some comments. In these conversations, they're like, I mean, you are aware that socialist states, they really trained the youth. Had them march, and they had pre-military training for the young people in Soviet states. I mean, you do know that, do you? And so it's just like detachment from reality, right? So our kids are supposed to be wimps, and the Russian kids are now training on AK-47s.
Yeah, learning how to throw hand grenades,
Yeah, yeah. And so
learning how to do first aid during a nuclear war, how to treat radiation
yeah,
burns and stuff.
exactly. So you always have to be involved, and you also, I mean, your kids eventually your kids will notice a disconnect, between what they're interested in, what people tell them to be interested in. They see the difference between their own parents and these other parents, and they ask questions about it. And then we try to give our kids a good answer for that. We try to
No,
explain these things to them.
it's got to be hard to explain something so complicated as what we've gotten ourselves into. It's just got to be a
Yeah.
nightmare to explain.
There was this one boy. I remember this one boy. The family has moved away since, but there was this one boy, and he was not allowed tools. So he
Wasn't allowed tools
no,
like
no,
wrenches and
no,
hammers and stuff.
no heck, no saws, no knives, no nothing.
Why?
So,
What's the rationale for that?
well, I mean, what can I tell you? I mean, I was at that place. I was at that place, and I saw these gigantic bookshelves full of socialist literature. And
Oh,
I figured that, well, they raise the kid with these ideas or whatever, but
with dolls?
the boy was not supposed to have toys. And so this one time, I was waiting in my car outside, and this was my old Ford Explorer. And so this boy comes up, and we're waiting for my kid, and so this boy starts to ask questions about the car and what does this knob do. And so we just pushes these buttons, and I explain what the buttons do, and he was just fascinated with technology. And this was like a starving kid. This was like somebody who was in his mind, he was starving. He was literally starving,
Oh,
and
that's so sad.
he was seeing an object, made by engineers, and it does things, and these huge tires and all these knobs and buttons and levers, and he was completely and utterly fascinated by it. So and of course, if your kids are not like this, then you're under suspicion. So some people, they suspected us to be AFD supporters, which we're not, because this is kind of their mindset. You're either one of them or you're one of these others, these other crazy people.
You got to be a different flavor of Moscow's pincer movement.
Exactly. So you want to? Oh
Yeah,
no, they're all pro Moscow, the left and the right. But yeah,
unbelievable.
this is what they do
Yeah.
to kids. This is what they do to kids in this country. And sometimes, sometimes a child, let's say a 7-year-old boy, 8-year-old boy, 9-year-old boy, sometimes they have questions about a serious topic, right? And for example, they sense a moral dilemma, or they sense that something important, and they will ask you a question. And if you give them a good answer, they will keep asking questions. And if you tell them, no, you're not supposed to talk about that, or you're not supposed to feel this and think that, and it's bad, you do that a couple of times, they will not ever ask you anything ever again. They will become detached, and they will, I don't know, look on the internet when they're older and see what, listen to some influencer tell them things. But
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, Alex, thank you, folks. This has been the Friends and Enemies discussion for this week. I'm Jeff Nyquist in the United States. That was Alex Benesch in Germany. And we have this discussion once a week, and we cover different topics, and we are focused in on this battle, this ongoing Cold War that people have swept under the rug, that they don't want to understand. It's very difficult to understand because the strategy is complex, and the changes in our society and its challenges are complex. So I hope that we've opened your eyes to some interesting points, and I hope you will join us next week at around the same time. Thank you.